Where did God come from? The atheist's favorite question. The reason Christians are oftentimes stumped by this question too is because it implies a finite God, a God that was created or had a beginning. But of course, if he was created, then who created the thing that created God? And it's just a circle. Do you see the problem with that? As Kent Hovind explains, time, space, and matter are a continuum. That means that all of those things must come together at the exact same time. Because if you had time but no space, where would you fill it? And if you had time and space but no matter, what would you fill it with? And if you had matter and space but no time, when would you put it? God answers this dilemma with the very first line of the Bible, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, time, God created the heavens, space, and the earth, matter. These things cannot exist independently, which the atheist cannot explain when trying to push the creation of the world without a creator. You see, where did God come from suggests that God is limited by time, but a God limited by time cannot have created it in the first place. The God of the Bible is not limited by time, or he would not be worthy of worshiping. The person who invented Pac-Man is not inside of the computer, because if the creator of Pac-Man always lived inside the game and played by its rules, they would not have been able to create it in the first place. There has to be something or someone outside of the world, outside of the limitations of this world, who made the limitations or laws of science to begin with. If we understood God completely, then he would not be God. You ask me where God comes from, and I ask you, where does truth come from? Evolutionary biologists would say that our ability to comprehend truth is no more than our ability to think whatever is most evolutionarily beneficial to us and our evolutionary descendants. But 2 + 2 = 4. You cannot possibly tell me that 2 + 2 = 4 because it's evolutionarily beneficial. We believe 2 + 2 = 4 because 2 + 2 does equal 4, always and everywhere. It is true. We make claims of truth beyond what is evolutionarily beneficial all the time. You ask me where God comes from, and I'll ask you, where do morals come from? Not only does God point to objective truth, but also objective morality. You don't see people following rules unless someone gave them rules to follow. So where did the human sense of good and bad come from, unless it came from something or someone greater than us? I believe God created the laws of science that point us to 2 + 2 = 4, just as he created objective morality. The belief in any moral ought requires us to believe in provable truths that must descend outside of ourselves. This is when people often say things like, well, religion often makes people do evil things, but how can you judge that religion is doing evil things without another frame of objective moral reference? Atheism cannot make moral claims rooted in atheism because it has no moral reference or framework. Trash God altogether and you cannot explain why you believe in objective truth or morality. This is not to say people who do not believe in God cannot live a moral life. In fact, they can and often do. That means that there is some objective truth in the world and morality. Now, let's bring up another heated question. Why would a perfect God allow for imperfection or immorality? While some people say that the fact that God allows suffering squashes their belief in God, I would say that it supports mine. How would we know we needed saving if there was nothing to save us from? So, why did he create the suffering? Well, I want to ask you to imagine a world without choice. There is no evil, no sin in a world because humans do not have the option to do it. There is only good. There is only good people doing good things, worshiping a good God. We are like robots. Now, if God wanted to make us like robots with no free will, no choice, he could have. But God wanted to have a relationship with his creation, giving them different minds and different hearts. And that also means creation who has as much free will as his sovereignty allows for. Now, how do we know that God did not want to create robots? Well, because when people become Christians, they still sin. I'm a perfect example of this. He does not eradicate the capability to do evil once you follow him because we still have choices. Atheists often view God as a tyrant, but have you heard of a tyrant that gave their people the option to disobey, actually putting that option easily for them to access? It was God who created the tree in the first place. God does not delight in suffering by any means, but again, it was our hearts that went against him in the first place. Also, in the Bible, suffering isn't always a bad thing. Seeing suffering and sin and darkness in a world makes us want the opposite. We are able to understand what God is saving us from, outside of ourselves and the world that we have created. You ask me where God comes from, and I'll ask you, what does meaning or purpose come from? Good and bad mean nothing if you're a random clump of matter with no purpose. And if you are a random clump of matter, why do you trust your own brain to tell you that you're a random clump of matter and how that came to be? Morality means nothing if humans have no inherent worth. If not God, then who gives us worth? Ourselves, the universe? Who gave the universe the authority to decide that? Without a higher power, we cannot objectively say what is good or bad. This is not to say atheists do not think that they are living a life with meaning. I believe that they are. But individually constructed meaning carries no significance when it is not objectively shared. I would not want to live a life in which meaning is dependent on myself because I know that I do not know everything, and this is why I turn to God. You ask me where God comes from, and I'll ask you, where does love come from? Explain why love exists and if it even does. You see, the only explanation we have for love is seen in the Trinity. You ask me where does God come from, and I'll ask you, where does communication come from? Because without the Trinity communicating with each other in Genesis 1, there's no explanation for how communication came to be and why it is here in the first place. You ask me where does God come from, and I'll ask you, where did you come from? Explain to me what greater things stepped in that lived outside of the laws of science, time, space, and matter, and created you inside of it. I'll end with a C.S. Lewis quote. Atheism turns out to be simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should have never found out it had no meaning. Just like if there was no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never knew that it was dark. Dark would be without meaning. Now, science itself requires certain presuppositions, such as the mystery of the existence of consciousness. If we understood God, we would be like God, but the belief in God inherently comes with the belief that you are not like God. The struggle of the existence of God and wrestling with questions like where does God come from is a part of faith, and thank goodness I can't fully explain God, or I would not need him in the first place.